It is unbelievably good to be here. I was thinking when Chris invited me to come and speak at this conference, he said, "You want to come to New Orleans?" And I said yes. And if he would have finished that with to talk about how particle physics is affecting the Second Vatican, I would have just said yes, I'll make it up. I just want to come here. I just love being here. Before we start, I want to clear a couple things up, though. I'm a Notre Dame alum and big fan. And I think I just want to clear the air and let you know that I have no resentment about you stealing Brian Kelly from the Irish. I'm really good with it, and I feel kind of bad that we took Mike Denbrock back after he had 2 great years here, but for those of you who are football players, for those of you who aren't, it's fine. Can I just see, how are you today? Like, you can do this. If you're an extrovert, you do it like this. If you're an introvert, you do it like this. Are you doing really great or not good or somewhere in the middle? Oh man, that's great. All right, I'll try not to ruin that. So let me just start by saying I'm so grateful to be a part of something like this, and here is why. I don't know if you're a student of history in this country or of the world, but we currently are living in a crisis, and you probably know that. There is a mental health crisis involving anxiety and loneliness. People in the world are suffering at levels never seen before in this country. And the question is, who's going to respond to it? Now, I think you're like me. I'm pretty relaxed. I don't think the church needs to do anything. I think the government's got it figured out. I think our leaders, our congressmen, they're just killing it right now, so we can just relax and come to Mass. No, so here's the thing. When you look back historically and you look at the problems this world has faced, things like poor people not having enough to eat, not having clean water, not having education, not having health care, and you say, how did those problems get solved? It was always Jesus' followers right at the front lines throughout the world. 200 years ago, 90% of the world lived in severe poverty. And today it's less than 10% of the world. And you know why that is? Look at the history. It's because our forebears in the faith, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, God has stirred them to face these issues. They've brought the kingdom of God. So here's the thing. We're living in I call it a cultural hurricane. That's the book I wrote, Cultural Hurricane. Because when you look at the data, it's a little scary. And if you don't drink already, you're going to want to start after you read about what's going on. Sorry for those of you who are in recovery. I'm sorry about the alcohol jokes. They come out. I never know I'm going to tell them. They just come out and we all hear it for the first time. We are going through this crisis, and what's happening is because of the use of cell phones, because of technology, our nervous system is changing. Our attention span used to be 12 seconds before the first iPhone came out. The average attention span now is 8 seconds. Now, you may not think that's a big deal, but goldfish have an attention span of 9 seconds. So we are now a full second thanks to smartphones. We're going through all kinds of, but it's not just changing that, it's changing our relationships. And we're going to talk about that today. Friendship is more difficult today. We are in a loneliness epidemic, and it's not just because we're less moral or less good. It's because our nervous system is changing. And so we find it harder to connect. And we're a little more afraid of people. Do you believe me? Oh, let's do a little experiment. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to turn to someone in the church here that you don't know and tell them who you plan to vote for in the next election and why. I'm glad you got the joke. I've done that in some churches and they're like, okay, and they turn. I'm like, no, don't do that. You don't want to talk about it. See, that's because our nervous systems are changing and we're more afraid of each other. And the question is, we have this crisis and who's going to respond to it? And I don't know about you, but I look at history and I say, it's going to be the Jesus followers. It's going to be the church. We are going to be on the front lines. And so today, I want to talk about how we got into this crisis. And then I'm going to talk about why it's so critical, why it affects our spirit so deeply. Because see, friendship and relationship, that makes us who we are as people. We become like Christ through relationship, primarily. That's how God meets us, through each other and through his son, of course. It also breaks the power of shame. And I would suggest to you that we are a culture swimming in shame right now. And rather than dealing with it, we're medicating it. And then the third thing is, I think we can change the world. I really do think that. That's not something that a speaker says at the beginning just to get you riled up. I really believe that the church right now is going to change the world. I really believe that the church is the only hope for the world. And if you don't think that's true, just take a minute and think, well, if it's not the church, then who? Is it your public school system? Are they just killing it? Is it the government? I mean, who's going to do it? I think we get to do it. So let's go ahead and let's just real briefly touch on what we have here with this loneliness crisis. You know, we are in if you want to Google the loneliness epidemic, you can. There's all kinds of data. And basically, the way I came to understand it was through the work of Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General about 10 years ago. And he, you know, when the Surgeon General gets appointed, the first thing they do is they say, well, how can we improve the health of the whole country? And so they look at things like heart disease, diabetes, deaths of despair like drug overdoses, alcoholism, cancer, and they try and see, can we do something as a country to improve health? And when Dr. Murthy looked at the data, he said he discovered a dark thread. And the dark thread is that of loneliness. Because when we're lonely, we have worse cardiovascular health. We're more likely to get cancer. We're more likely to, of course, die deaths of despair. Even dementia is affected by our loneliness. I want to point something else out. You'll notice for the first time in the history of measuring loneliness, young people, those 19 to 29-year-olds, think about your grandsons and your sons and your nephews. These are the loneliest people in our country. And here's why I think that's a special problem for us as men. You know, when I'm looking around, I'm 60. I think a lot of guys here are somewhere in the ballpark of me. And when we were growing up, there was no question about what it meant to be a man. You know, I lived in Detroit. The men did the hard, heavy lifting jobs, or they went to the military. Some of my friends went to the military. We worked on the assembly line. Because men were needed. From the beginning of time, men have been needed with their strength to protect the community. So it's been very clear what it means to be a man. Today, it's less clear. You know, the military has gone largely electronic, and so people sit behind computers and fire missiles, and women can do that as well as men can. And in the auto industry, what I'm familiar with, you know, the heavy lifting isn't done by people anymore, it's done by robotics and automation. And so I'm watching young men who are quite confused about what does it mean to be a man in this world? And so my encouragement for you and for me is that we need to engage these young men especially, young women too, but young men especially, so that we can infuse in them what it means to be a man in the church and in the community, because there's a special role for us, and we're going to talk more about that. The other big study that I think is helpful to understand the loneliness epidemic is a book, you maybe have heard of the Harvard Study of Adult Development. Bob Waldinger is the latest researcher. The bottom line is they followed guys who went to Harvard and then matched them with guys who lived in the slums, really, of Boston. And they've been following them since 1930. Full medical evals, interviews, interviewing family, looking at their kids. And here's the bottom line. The better predictor of a long and happy life is quality friendship. Quality friendship is more important than social class, IQ, or genes. And so if you're looking for what God might be telling you today, maybe what God is wanting to say is, so commit to good friendship and then eat and drink whatever you want. I think that may be the message from that. Okay, not really. Okay, so let's talk. I want to talk about how we got here and then why it's such a spiritual issue. And then I have some real practical things if you're in a men's group, how to maybe recharge your men's group, if that's an okay place for us to head. And if it's not, that is where we're heading, so it'd be real embarrassing if you leave. And we may talk about you behind your back if you do. So how did we get to be so lonely? Well, I think the simplest way to understand that is as screens have come into our lives, we've spent less time with each other. In the second half of the 20th century is when you see loneliness levels start to creep up. And that's when the first TVs came into the living room. You know, before that, even the design of homes would have big porches, because people would have dinner and then they'd go sit on the porch afterwards. It was a little cooler, and then you'd interact with your neighbors. I know that's what I did in Detroit. You'd sit around. Everyone, I grew up in kind of an Irish Catholic slum of sorts in the south part of Detroit. And so, where we said everyone was Catholic and everyone was Irish. And so that meant you could take out a 9-iron and hit someone who was drinking at any time of day. And so, and not me. I mean, they didn't let me have my first beer till I was like 11. So, but everyone else was drinking. So, but they would people would come around and sit around the porch, and the neighbors would come. We'd listen to the Detroit Tigers baseball games, and that was life. The neighborhood was it. As time has gone on, you may notice that houses they build today have really tiny little porches, right? Big patios in the back. It's much more, we're private. People are inside, because as those screens have gotten more interesting, we went from Tom Brokaw to news porn, insanity, which is what I call MSNBC and Fox News. It's insanity because it so gets us scared of the other side and just tells us the other side is going to steal democracy and whatever they're saying. They're just saying, right? They're trying to scare us all the time. But so we're now inside looking at screens. In fact, a wonderful book, if you're interested in this kind of thing, is called Last Child in the Woods. And Robert Louv talks about how our young people, if I were to ask you, what did you do to play when you were a kid? Where did we go to play? Outside. And our parents were right with us, right? Helicopter, making sure we didn't get in trouble. No, no, right? I mean, I always said, there were 7 kids in our family. So, my mom and dad, it's kind of like, well, you lose one, you still got 6. But you'd play, come back when the street lights are on, and where would you go? You'd go to the edges of creation, wouldn't you? You'd find the bogs and the creeks and the swamps, and and your mom and dad would say, don't go past there, so you'd go, 50 feet past there just because that's what you did. And you explored nature, and you did it with friends, and it turns out when you're in nature with people, your relationships heal. So, pro tip number 1, if your wife is giving you a hard time, don't sit down with her in the living room and look at her and try and have a conversation. Go to nature and go for a walk and notice what's in nature. It helps soothe all of us down. So we're not spending, we stopped interacting with each other as we've gotten more and more screens. And so, and one of the big changes that now that we've been spending less time with each other is we've had this drop in empathy. And so, I think this gives us an idea of why. Yeah, it's funny, but it's also true, isn't it? And here's the bottom line. The more we get screens in our life, the worse our empathy gets. And here's why. Because for us to feel connected with each other and have empathy with each other, we need to look at each other. Communication is anywhere from 70 to 92% nonverbal. So I need to be able to see your face and know when you're being sarcastic. I mean, have any of you ever sent a text and tried to be funny or sarcastic, and then you really hurt somebody's feelings? And emojis only go so far. Right, so we used to spend, before smartphones, get this, 20 minutes a day looking at our phones. Now that we have smartphones, us older people, we spend about 4 hours and 35 minutes looking down at our phone. Our children are spending over 8 hours. I'm doing a project with the Vatican and a group in Africa. The African teens that have phones are spending over 9 hours a day looking at their phones. This is having radical changes on our nervous system, and it's really killing our ability to have empathy. And why is that? Because empathy requires tone and pace of voice, expressions, posture, gestures. Here's the cool thing. All this artificial intelligence, they can't teach computers empathy. And there's all kinds of programs that look at your face while you're talking, trying to read your emotions, and when your mouth goes down. But you can't figure people are complicated. And if you don't believe me, how many of you are married? Yeah, come on, right? It's a mystery that just keeps going. I've been married 35 years, and sometimes my wife will get mad about something, and I'll listen to her, and I'll look at her, and I'll be like, wow, you are just amazing. Like, this is really quite the beautiful path of purification. In fact, I was telling these guys last night, my wife and I give talks together on marriage, and we were just talking this past weekend at World Marriage Day, and I said, but marriage is this beautiful path of purification. It is like we are in a cauldron of boiling metal being purified so the gold comes to the top. My wife said, it's also joyful. Oh yeah, good point. And so because of that, we miss social cues. I saw a guy at Starbucks today, no iPhone, no laptop, no tablet, just sat there drinking coffee like a psychopath. And what's really cool? And this, young people who are spending 8 hours a day looking at their phones, they aren't as good at social intelligence. Have you noticed that? Like your grandkids, and they don't get jokes. because they don't get the complexity of relationship. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do, you could take your little nephew or your grandson to a coffee shop or a restaurant, and you could look around and you could teach your nephew all what you're seeing. You know, you go to a Starbucks, and I do this. If I'm meeting someone for coffee, I don't bring my phone in. I sit down and I get a cup of coffee and I just look around, and it's fun. You know, you could say, oh, there's a couple. Look at that. Oh, they're fighting. He's holding something back. I think he's lying. I can see that he's lying on his face, right? Right. Oh, this guy, they're going to break up soon. I can tell. Oh, a job interview. You're not going to get the job. I can see it right now. Because we know all that because we didn't have phones growing up. So, you know, I don't know, but I grew up in a house, you know, we had 9 people and 1,000 square feet. So survival depended on learning. You know, if my mom was having a bad day, you know, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And so you got to keep an eye, you got to study for your survival. Today, you know, our kids grow up in these big rooms, they got screens and all that. They're not learning the essential survival skills. Why am I telling you this? Because I think we can be the teachers. We can communicate to our kids and grandkids what this empathy is all about, because empathy is so key. The other thing is we are living in a much faster paced world. And here's the thing, when we are going quickly, empathy doesn't work. The nervous system can't do empathy. And that's because of something called the insula and the way the insula works. You may have heard of the Princeton Divinity School study. Have you heard this study? It's one of my favorites in my field. This was a while back. They took this group of seminary students and they had them all prepare a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And they said, well, you're going to prepare this and then we're going to have you give this sermon on the other side of campus. And so as they were prepared, and they broke them into 3 groups. And the first group, they said, go ahead and give the sermon now, but you got plenty of time. You can stop and get a coffee, whatever. You can relax. The second group, they said, if you leave right now, you'll get there on time. And the third group, they said, sorry, you're late. You got to hurry. Then they tricked them all. To get to this auditorium where they gave their sermon, they had to go through this alley. And on this alley, there was an actor pretending to be kind of beaten up and sore and sick and in need of help, asking for help. The people who were given plenty of time, most of them stopped and helped the person who was on the side of the road hurt. The group that was in a hurry, only 13% of these seminary students stopped to help the person. So just to review, the story of the Good Samaritan is a story about someone being hurt on the side of the road, and people passed this person by, and then finally the Samaritan stopped and attended to the person's need. So these seminary students, while on their way to give a sermon about the Good Samaritan and the importance of stopping if someone's hurt on the side of the road, only 13% of them stopped. And the point is, our brain doesn't do empathy when we're in a hurry. And that is because this part of the brain called the insula, now the insula connects the higher cortical functions with our body. And here's how empathy works in a nutshell. If you're talking to someone and they tell you something sad or hard, you process all of it without even knowing it. You're processing their verbal, nonverbal, they're all those things we talked about. And then that goes down into your body and it goes searching for a body memory. You know, I was talking to a guy at a men's group recently, and he was visiting, and he told me about his wife who was quite sick and might die. And as he was talking to me, tears started coming out of my eyes. He just thought I was such a Christ follower, like, boy, what a loving man that Tim is. The truth is, I went through this with my wife about 4 years ago. She was quite sick, had cancer, it spread, she almost died, and I had to imagine what life would be like without her. So I had body memory of imagining life without my wife. So I'm talking, that's empathy. It has to. The problem is the insula is not myelinated, so it's a very slow. It's like, boy, he's really getting into the weeds here, isn't he? Yeah. It's a part of the nervous system that's not. That's very slow. So if you're in a hurry, it doesn't work. And because of that, we aren't as socially skilled as we once were. I kind of like this little meme. It says, "I just found out the neighborhood had a meeting about the crazy person on the block." How weird! They didn't invite me. So let's talk about why this is a spiritual issue. And it's a spiritual issue because friendship creates character. It makes us who we are. You might want to think of yourself as an average of your 3 closest friends. Hopefully one of those friends is up here on the altar, but you're an average of your 3 closest friends. It's going to break the power of shame and it heals community. So what do we mean when we say it creates character? So back when I was a young dad, I was studying something called interpersonal neurobiology, which is the study of how we exchange energy and information with each other when we communicate using high-speed video and everything. It's a wonderful field, and it's the way I work with couples. Very effective. It surprises people how much we can know about a relationship just by studying this. Well, as I'm studying this, my daughter, Megan, she's the second oldest. She's a little like me, a little ADHD. Like you're kind of noticing, Tim forgot his Ritalin today, so he's a little all over the place. And I just tell you, there's not enough Ritalin to control what happens in my head. It's like Anne Lamott says, my mind is like a bad neighborhood. I try not to go there alone. So anyway, we're raising my daughter, and she's, distractible. She gets overwhelmed, falling accident after accident all summer long. Like, we almost thought she had some kind of neurological problem. I mean, she would be so enthralled watching a bird that she would trip and fall, and like her face would scrape on the cement. At one point, she had so many scabs on her face and arms and elbows that when the doorbell rang, I'd tell my wife, hey, it's protective services. Do you want to get it? Because she looked like we were not competent parents. Anyway, we'd go for a walk, and this is what would happen. Megan would be walking. She'd trip. She'd fall, hit the ground hard, scream bloody murder like the world was going to end. You've all had this experience, right, with a toddler, screaming. And we'd run over, and we'd pick her up. And we'd do every time. We'd hold her, and we'd rock her back and forth, and we'd say, oh, it's okay, little pumpkin, you're going to be okay. And she'd go, oh. We'd say, does it sting? And she'd say, yeah. And we'd say, oh, it's okay, little pumpkin, we're here. And after a couple minutes, she would wiggle to get down, and you put her down, right? And continue on the walk to get ice cream. Now, we would have snot and blood and everything all over our clothes, which I always say, this is like a metaphor for parenting, right? I mean, this is kind of what the whole journey's about. But anyway, now the question is, what happened between Megan and myself, between Megan and the babysitter and my wife? What interpersonal neurobiology would say is that what happened was there was this exchange of energy and information. And you can measure this on faces, once there is resonance and attunement between the two people, where it's like, oh, I get you, like, oh, little pumpkin. Once that's there, then the hurt person can release their pain into us. And once we feel it, we say, oh, that stings. That's a signal to her that she can release the pain. And then we say, it's going to be okay. She takes in the comfort. It's a literal exchange of energy and information. Now, that was cool. But here was the even cooler part. About 6 months later, we were trapped inside because I live in the Detroit area and it's cold in the wintertime. And every year, everyone says, why do we live in Detroit? Why don't we go move south? And we don't. But we were there trapped, and we had one of these dolls in the other room. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. They're dolls that just cry at random times. And, you'd just be sitting there and it goes, and you got to pick it up and do this to it, and then it stops crying. They're quite annoying. In fact, I wonder if it was if like some religious order created them to convince young women to become nuns, because it makes the whole childcare thing feel bad. But if you do have one of those and it starts crying, you can do this, or you can always pick it up and give it a good hard shake, and it also stops crying. My wife told me I shouldn't do that in front of the kids. I'm not sure why, but so anyway, we're in the family. We goes, and I go to get it, and Megan says, "I'll get it, Daddy." And we hear her little feet pitter patter into the other room, and then we hear her say, "It's okay, little pumpkin. Megan is here," using the same inflection, the same kind of resonant, attuned voice that we used with her all summer long. So what happens? What happened is, we become who we are through relationship. Megan was becoming loving because she was internalizing the people who loved her. We call these introjects. It's like a little one of me was inside of her, and a little one of my wife was inside of her. And that's how we become who we are. Do you ever open your mouth and your parent comes out? Yeah. Like one of the big things, when you got 9 people in 1,000 square foot, there's no room for anger and there's no room for sadness. You just become stoic. So like if you start crying, my mom's favorite line was, "You stop crying or I'm going to give you something to cry about." Now I got to college, I went to see a therapist, and it turns out that wasn't great for my emotions. It turns out I had a few anger management issues. Who would have known? But when I started raising my kids, I'd be like, "Would you stop crying? I'm going to give you something to cry about." Like, whoa, where did that come from? It's like, Dad? Like, it becomes inside of us. Or my favorite one, when the kids got older, I used to say, they'd come home late for curfew when they were in high school. And I'd be like, "Your brother Benjamin used to come home late." And they'd say, "We don't have a brother Benjamin." And I'd say, "Not anymore, you don't." And then my kids, because I raised them with emotional sensitivity, would be like, "Oh, Dad, that's terrible." And I'm like, "Yeah, tell your therapist someday. It's not that bad." But see, this is how we become people of faith. Quite honestly, this is how we become people of faith. The National Study on Youth and Religion says that what's the best predictor of young people being people of faith? It's having parents or grandparents, but usually parents, who are people of faith, who are practicing their faith, who are praying, who they can watch. Because why? When they watch that caregiver, someone they love, and they see you go to Mass, and they see you praying, that internalizes in them. That's real seed. They become more like you. We really aren't like rugged individuals. We really are people who are, we're made through relationship. It's almost as if we're made in the image and likeness of a God who is Trinitarian, who is three but one, who is in relationship. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. And this is why we need each other. This is why we need Christian friendship. About 4 years ago, I had this really epic season. You know, I'd been running this ministry for 25 years. It was a big Christian counseling center in a tough neighborhood in Detroit. We grew it from 3 therapists to 12, hundreds of sessions every month. We're just thrilling. But then it was clear God was moving me on, and so short story is, I left and I knew it was going to close. At the same time, something came up with one of my kids that was incredibly difficult and has stayed difficult. And then my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and then we thought we caught it early, and we didn't, and it spread. And so she needed a whole series of surgeries and chemo and radiation, and we didn't know that she was going to make it. All this is going on. And so I had a spiritual director, so I went to him and I said, hey, Father Pat, I got all these changes, new job. I'm a caregiver now for my wife, and I got to do this thing with my kid, which is, I never prepared for this. I'm a psychologist. This wasn't supposed to happen. And so I said, I need to redo it all. So I said, I have a binder, you know, because this is what I do with people. I have like a mission statement, values, vision, 3-year, 4-year, and it's like, I'm kind of proud of it. And then key journaling insights, because I'm a little OCD. And I said, so I really need to rework this thing. I need a new vision, all that. And he said, and sorry, I'm going to swear in church, but he swore, so that's okay. He said, Tim, put your damn binder down. They put it down. He said, go into the chapel and sit with Jesus and tell him what's going on and share your pain and see him on the cross and let him look at you. He's a Passionist priest in a Passionist retreat house, so Jesus' eyes are open on their crucifix. He said, let your eyes meet and let him feel your pain. In other words, go be with my friend Jesus. And I think that's what we do with people. And it was a beautiful week-long retreat. And when I came back, my wife was quite happy. I was away for a week. She was the one who encouraged me to go away. And so that's what we need, people like that who remind us, you know who you need right now? You kind of need to sit with Jesus. That's kind of the thing you need. So this is the first thing. This is how it creates character. This is why when we are with each other, sometimes we need to know when we're in a stuck situation. We need to call a Christian brother, because sometimes those words come inside of us. And I'm guessing you've had this experience, right? And so if it's true that we are the average of our 3 closest friends, we need to have some of those friends be able to show us Jesus so we can internalize that. And one last thing. I don't know what you think of this, but you know, we believe as Catholics something called theosis, which means over time, we become more and more like Jesus. Jesus transforms us to become more and more the people we're supposed to be. It's a real process. It's not like we just belong to some group and we have tribal things and it's a philosophy that we adopt. It's not that. It's real. Our energy transforms and changes. And it transforms and changes in relationship. This is how we become saints, is through these relationships and taking each other's influence in. So, friendship creates who we are. The second thing is it breaks the power of shame. Shame is such an interesting emotion. You know, it's the first negative emotion that shows up in the Bible with Adam and Eve when they go against what God asked for them. Then they experience this thing called shame, and they make little fig leaves and they cover themselves. Now the question is, what is shame? Well, psychologically, it is when you feel like there's something wrong with you, like you're not enough, or maybe there's something defective. And I might even ask you to just notice when the last time you had that feeling was. And I'm going to bet, I did this with a group once, I said, how many have had a wave of shame in the last 24 hours? And it was like, how about the last 12? How about the last 6? How about the last 2? How about the last 1? How about the last 10 minutes? And like, because we constantly get this whisper, if people only knew that about me, they wouldn't love me. You know, if the guys in my small group really knew that, if all the other Catholic, man, look at all these Catholic guys, they're so great. If they knew that I do this, or I did that, or I have this secret, that's what shame is. And I think it is the number one weapon the enemy uses to try and take us out. to try and make us feel like we can't be the one to reach out to our grandson, or we can't be the one because we feel like something's wrong. Here's the thing from interpersonal neurobiology. When a person is experiencing shame through two different systems, for those of you who like the science of it, the vagal system and the limbic system, it is a state where you cannot learn. If you are feeling ashamed, if you feel shame, you cannot learn something new. You certainly are not going to experience transformation. You need an encounter with a person. The brain needs a person to break that. I had a colleague who had a son who was just one of those kids. I mean, he's a great guy, psychologist. Larry was his name. And his kid was just into addictions from the time he was a young adolescent, struggled with addiction. And Larry tried everything we know as psychologists. He was tough love, kind love, compassion, loving him. Let me meet your drug friends. Let me not meet your drug friends. Like, he tried everything. Finally, this kid moved out of his house. And he lost touch for several months. But Larry prayed every day for him and had us praying for him every day. Well, one day, it's midnight, he gets awakened by a phone call. It's the local county sheriff who said, "We have your son here." And he said he wants you to come pick him up. And so Larry thought, all right, God, I've been praying. This must be the opening. So he left what he was doing. He went to the county courthouse there, or to the police, and he got there, and his son was gone. They said, sorry, one of his friends came and bailed him out. So Larry was praying, like, what do I do? He said, I'm going to go see if he's okay. So he went to the last known residence of his son, a drug house, basically. He got there. The door was open. The screen door was there unlocked. And he looked in and saw his son on the couch. And so he walked in, and he stood over his son, and he just laid his hand above him and very silently prayed for him, really feeling grateful that his son was alive and safe and okay. And then he left, and he didn't hear anything for more than 6 months. And just after 6 months, he had his doorbell ring, and he came to the door, and it was his son, cleaned up. And he said, Dad, 6 months ago, I wasn't sleeping. And when you left, I said to myself, I want to worship that man's God. And it was that day that his son got clean and has stayed clean. How did that happen? Larry broke the power of shame. He was relentlessly loving and positive and constantly caring for his son. Now, how does that happen in our world? I don't know who the people who are crucified in the margins are in your world. I know where I live, and because of the work I do, I see a number of Catholic families with children who identify as being gay or lesbian, sometimes transgender, but usually gay or lesbian. Let me tell you what happens for a child who has all that confusion going on. They start feeling confused about their sexuality or gender, and then they start meeting friends online, and they get the courage to come out, and they come out as gay or lesbian. Here's what often happens with good, devout Christian people. We don't know what to do or say to them, and so we just quietly withdraw. And you may think about, I'm guessing most of us here have someone close to us who identifies as gay or lesbian. You may think about your response to them, because then what happens for these young people is they feel this distance. They go to the family party and no one talks to them. And so they gravitate toward people online in the gay community. And what do they find there? They find grace and love and say, you can be a part of us. And that just strengthens the sense of who they are. So let me just throw this out there. And I've said this to various groups, and people have come back and said, thanks for that. It really helped. If you have like a niece, nephew, or a child or a grandchild, I might suggest you consider engaging. Not engaging and giving a lecture, but just praying for them, texting them, spending time with them. See if they'll meet you for coffee, not to talk about their sexuality, just to meet them as people. Why? Because that breaks the power of shame. Because now they're in a face-to-face loving encounter with you, and they know they're being loved no matter what. So whoever the people are in your world that might feel shame, I want to encourage you, including guys in your small group, if that's the case. So we're saying friendship is how we become who we are. We internalize each other. Friendship is how we break the power of shame. It's how we create men's groups where people suddenly feel okay talking with one another. There's a men's ministry that I kind of helped get going, and the original 4 guys, they decided to go away and talk about what God was doing in them, because they were going to start a parachurch ministry. And so they had a retreat place for the weekend. They got there on Friday night. And this was just when high-speed internet came out about 20 years ago. And they, as they stopped the car, the driver of the car, who was going to be the leader, said, all right, guys, before we take another step, I just got to tell you this. I'm struggling with pornography, and I don't know what to do about it, but I just need to get that out because it weighs so heavy on me. And the car was quiet for a minute, and then the guy in the passenger seat said, me too. And then, after another break, the two guys in the back said, me too, me too. All four of these guys were struggling. And that broke the power of shame that they could then start talking about how do we support each other and care for each other. So we need to be able to break that power of shame. As they say, people don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's why small groups and Christian friendship breaks the power of shame. Last thing that I think it does here is spiritual friendship heals community. And just real briefly about this, two things. One, this past year, my wife is in leadership at our church, and we had the St. Vincent de Paul Christmas gathering. So we all went there. And we were having the best time of our lives, just salt of the earth people. These people who, a lot of them retired, given their life to take care of people who are poor, people who are... but at one point, I looked around and I realized that this group was split about 50-50. They were like Democrats and Republicans. Like politically, we're supposed to hate each other. Like politically, we're supposed to believe the other side is going to ruin the country. Am I right? I mean, look at those people. They're going to turn it into a socialist enclave, or the other people are going to break democracy and make it a dictatorship. We're supposed to hate each other. And we don't hate each other. And this is what church does. I was here at the Gulf Coast Conference, I think 5 or 6 years ago. I had a chance to speak at it. And how many have been to the Gulf Coast Conference here? Yeah, so I got there and I was going through the booths. They let anyone open a booth at this thing. And so there were there's people who want to talk about women's rights and ordination for deacons. If you talk to them, they don't put that on their banner. And then there's people who want to revert back to the Latin Mass. There's nuns at full habits, real traditional, super progressive, everywhere. And I was walking around and I was starting to feel shame. There's something wrong with you. If they knew what I thought, they would never think whatever. In fact, when I started speaking to this group, I said, I'm pretty sure that you think some people in this room aren't going to heaven. And everyone laughed because that's the way we feel. But here's what happened, which was so beautiful, so different, so diverse. And then as we were, it was time for liturgy. And I was sitting up in the back because I was preparing to speak. And I was like, God, why do I feel how can we all be together? I feel this different. I don't feel like I fit. And then the crucifix comes in, and the priest comes in, and the bishop comes in, and you realize, oh yeah, it's this. We are all one in Christ. And you don't have to fully understand your brother who votes for the other guy. You don't have to, we're one. We are one community, and it is Christ that holds us together, and we got to lean into that. And I think we can do that. I think we can go into the world and make that kind of difference. In fact, just to put a cherry on the top of that Sunday, when I was here, I had never been to a true jazz place anywhere, really. I had, but not in New Orleans. And so after we did our fancy French dinner and all that kind of stuff, I said goodbye to all the wonderful leaders, and then I went to McDonald's because I was still hungry. And then... which is what happens at fancy French restaurants. And then I went and was just listening to jazz, found a jazz club and was sitting back, had a beer, and listening to the relationship between the musicians. And that has become a metaphor for me of the church. Everyone's got their own thing, and we do this in relationship with each other, and it is beautiful when it's all together. So I think we can do this. I think we can have that kind of transformation in the world. So last thing, and then I'm going to stop. I have about 9 minutes left here. For those of you who are wondering, when is this going to end? 9 minutes is the answer to your question. Because I've been in small groups for over 20 years and I've helped launch 2 men's ministries, I've watched small groups flourish and I've watched small groups die. So for those of you who are in a small group, I just feel like I just want to tell you some of the things I've learned and see if any of it applies, take it. If not, you can dismiss it. But I think for small groups to flourish, we need essential structure. One of the things I found in my small group is someone's got to be the leader. That consensus, well, when should we meet again? And what should we talk about? Let's talk about it. What do you want to do? Let's talk about it. No, pick one guy and say, you're the dictator for the next year. You facilitate meetings. You help us figure out what we're going to do. The other thing is do stuff. Sometimes, especially if you're launching a new men's group, go serve soup at a kitchen. We did something like that in my small group every 6th week because we had a real OCD guy who put it on Excel and color-coded it. So every 6th week, we would go to a bar and drink beer and play pool, which I was good with. I mean, I like serving the poor, but that was, I really also like that. So also clarify confidentiality. You know, many small groups fall apart because the husband says, I'm not keeping any secrets from my wife. And if that's the way men are, it makes sense, but the small group is not going to go. Men need to have an agreement with their wife that I'll tell you in general how the group went, but I'm not going to tell you any details about any of the men. And then when you add members, do it with intention, meaning you can't have a rotating small group or you'll notice you can't go deep. You need to have some boundaries. It's like the container has to be closed. Like, who is the saint who said you got to keep the oven closed if you want it to heat up? You can't constantly be changing. The second thing is vulnerability without oversharing. This just happens but this means like be willing to take small risks and share things that you might be embarrassed about. My experience is almost always people are going to be like, oh yeah, me too. I struggle with that as well. And if not, then you'll feel ashamed and embarrassed, and then you'll need to get a therapist, which is okay. The last thing is the grace-filled listening. Rather than encouraging and solving. As men, we are great problem solvers, aren't we? Or even just encouragers. When I do a lab with my seminary students, it's not part of the course, but I require it anyway, and I haven't been busted yet. So where I actually monitor them listening, practicing listening. And I have a great story. Harville Hendricks, who's my mentor, who wrote a book called Getting the Love You Want. Terrible title, great book about marriage. He was learning the power of listening, and his wife there, Helen Hunt, who's a big, rich oil family woman, and they were at a big benefit, and he was sitting at a table with a bunch of wealthy people, and he decided that night he was only going to listen. No matter what happened, he just listened. And someone would say, so tell me about your kids, Harville, and he'd say, oh yeah, they're back in Texas. Tell me about your kids. Like, how many do you have again? And he was very in a very manipulative way, he was able to get the people to only talk about themselves. Well, at the end of the night, Helen was at the door saying goodbye to people. She came to him after and she said, honey, what did you talk about at your table? The people at your table said you were the most interesting man in the world. So don't let go of the power of listening. And anytime we're building friendship, this is going to be the key. Remember, it activates the parts of people's brains that allows us to connect. The last thing is to pray. I know we're all talking about this, but when you have a small group, it can so quickly become a social group. So whoever is leading, I always encourage, right when you start, let's say, what do we need to pray for? Let's take prayer requests and pray, and then do what we're going to do. When we stop praying, the men's group stops functioning, I believe. Unless you're out drinking beer and playing pool, then you pray if you want, but that's your free day. Last thing. It's easy to think we can't influence other men in our life. And I'm encouraging you now to be thinking about who needs your encouragement. It's easy to think we can't do it, but I was probably 8-9 years ago now, I gave a little marriage enrichment talk at a Catholic church, the usual 100 people, 50 couples, and as I always say, if I'm going to do a marriage enrichment talk, you got to think about the guy who's getting dragged there by his wife, so make sure you have beer and pizza and whatever, and so that's what we did. At the end, a couple came up and they said, hey, look, we didn't need this, we're fine, and I said, you're welcome, and then they said, but our dear friends are divorcing, and it's going to be final next Friday, and we don't know what to do. And I think because it was the end of the night, I was exhausted, and I could not wait to get a beer when it was all done. I said, well, what do they drink? And they said Bud Light. And I said, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you go grab a 12-pack and stop by their house and tell them what you just told me, that you're sad. You love them. You're not trying to shame them. But man, you really value their marriage, and you value their family. And you're going to be sad when they divorce. And then here's the important part. Say, we'll watch your kids for the weekend if you'll go do a weekend designed for couples that are in trouble. We all know Retrovi. They would happen to do a different one. So the couple said, all right. They left. I didn't hear anything. About 4 months later, I get a new couple in my practice, at the counseling center. And I come out, and there's a couple there, and they're holding hands. And I'm like, okay, that's wrong. Because people who come to me don't like each other at all, but I bring them in and I said, so what's going on? And they said, about 4 months ago, we were a week away from finalizing our divorce. And then at 10 o'clock at night, our doorbell rang and our dear friends were standing on the porch with a 12-pack of Bud Light. And they encouraged us to give it one more chance. And they told us about this weekend, and we went on this weekend, and God woke us up that we had lost our minds and we needed to stay together for the sake of the kids and the community. So we just wanted to thank you for suggesting they do that. I was like, well, I was actually just preoccupied with beer that night, but good, you're welcome. So here's the point. You can make a difference. Even today, you may want to, on break, text that person in your family who you know is lonely and isolated, could be older. Think about the young people in your life. Last thing, if you want more information, feel free to email me. I'll send you these slides. If there was any of these slides you wanted, feel free to do that. I think it's being recorded too, right, Chris? So that you can have access to it that way. I would love to support you and your small group any way I can. This is the book, The Gift of Cultural Hurricanes. It's all about understanding how our nervous system is changing, how our relationships are changing, and how our spirituality is changing. It's a mix of interpersonal neurobiology and our Catholic tradition with a lot of just spiritual practices you're familiar with, but how to bring those into marriage and family life so that we can reconnect with God during this thing. Also, you'll see these out there. Feel free to take one. I don't want to take them back to Detroit with me. This is free. I recorded videos to guide people through the book because one thing I've learned about men in small groups, I don't know if you've learned this, they don't read. We don't read books. I love reading books, but every small group I've been in, I'd be like, this is a small little book. It's like 48 pages. Let's just take 3 pages a week. And I get to the man and I said, you guys get a chance to read? Yeah, no, Tim, I didn't get a chance to read. So I have meditated on the Serenity Prayer. I've come to accept that. And so we made these videos so that it's a plug and play. All you got to do is sit in your group and play the video. There's questions for discussion. It's all free. It can help you talk about this stuff. You don't even have to buy the book. You'll be able to figure it out from the videos and the questions. So I want to thank you for this. Honestly, I do believe that the church is the hope of the world, and I do believe it takes men who are courageous and willing to take initiative to make a difference. And so that is my hope for you. And if it's okay with you, can I pray for us as I end this time? Yeah, so let's just pause and acknowledge God's presence here. And God, we do pray that your kingdom would come for us in ways that would be beyond what we could imagine as we are here, that you'd speak to us, as the Archbishop encouraged us, that when we go home, we would have the courage to engage, to reach out to people who need friendship, to be people who cultivate a kinder, gentler society. Pray that you'd energize us for that task. Pray that you would bless us now. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.